Christopher Bell is an East Harlem historian. Chris holds a master's in history from City College. He's a lifelong East Harlemite. He's written 3 books on East Harlem, and a full chapter on Mark's life appears in his latest book, East Harlem Remembered. I'd like to welcome Chris Bell.
Thank you very much. I had the honor to grow up in East Harlem, as he mentioned. But I'd like to read public officials who gave proclamations but who could not be here. Congressman Charles Rangel, Congressman Elliot Engel, Bronx Borough President Ruben Diaz Jr., Manhattan Borough President Gail Brewer, and State Senator Jose Serrano Jr., whose proclamation, or portions of a proclamation I will read from. The Council Speaker had touched on many of the parts of the proclamation, so I want to read a little bit. Whereas Vito Marcantonio was born on December 10th, 1902, to an Italian immigrant mother and American-born father, both from the city of Potenza in the Basilica region of southern Italy, and grew up in East Harlem when it contained the largest Little Italy in the United States and attracted Puerto Ricans to an area that emerged as El Barrio. And whereas viewed as the opposite of political elitism, Marcantonio received thousands of letters of gratitude during his lifetime that characterized him as tribune of the people and the people's politician. Many Catholics and non-Catholics alike who received his help or were inspired by him named their children after him. And I'm on page 2. And whereas Marcantonio is a masterful role model and frame of reference for leadership and coalition building, useful for confronting the issues during his time and issues we face today, such as civil rights, integration, labor rights, and equality of opportunity for economic independence and sustainability for the poor and middle class. Therefore, be it known that the Vito Marcantonio Forum is convinced that the life and work of Vito Marcantonio have been unfairly ignored and present to people today guidelines for progressive politics that promises significant gains for a more genuinely democratic United States, and therefore be it resolved that State Senator Jose M. Serrano with pride honors the contributions of Representative Vito Marcantonio and his benefit to New York City, the United States, and the world, along with the efforts of the Vito Marcantonio Forum to honor the Congressman's memory on the 60th anniversary of his death on August 9, 2014. In witness whereof I have hereunto set my hand signature, Jose M. Serrano, New York State Senate 29th District, and this is the Senate District represents East Harlem, where Vito Marcantonio served in Congress. As mentioned, I have parts of my book. This is excerpts that I did on Marcantonio. It was interesting when I did my oral history and picture books, the one politician that I talked to that everyone remembers was Vito Marcantonio. I'm going to read a portion when I talked to Annette T. Rubenstein, and she told me that Mark really loved the people of East Harlem, and it wasn't fake. Mark worked 18 hours a day, 7 days a week. Despite these long hours in East Harlem, he had the best attendance record in Congress, for he never missed a session. He did this while working in the neighborhood every weekend. Mark found time to do all this somehow, and many times he didn't sleep. Mark would lug these position papers, and for international affairs, he was remarkably devoted. And he was honest and had tremendous energy, despite his diabetes, which is why he never drove, because Mark was afraid he might black out. Another section involving Marcantonio were the people that actually saw him. As mentioned before, Marcantonio was like a quasi or congressman of the Puerto Rican people. He supported the independence of Puerto Rico, supported Spanish as the official language of Puerto Rico when English was conferred upon that island. Manny Diaz Jr., who grew up in Puerto Rico and served in World War II, remembers seeing Marcantonio. He was a Puerto Rican East Harlemite who recently passed away several years ago. He says, the election eve rally was held on 116th Street and Lexington Avenue, the Lucky Corner. Thousands of people would be there, and Marcantonio had an interesting way of orating. He would start very quiet and very slow, and then he would start getting excited. Next, he raised his voice and he ended up screaming. Marcantonio knew how to turn that crowd up. Mary Kukley, Jewish East Harlemite. Every politician went to the Lucky Corner on 116th Street. And when Marcantonio spoke, he did so with a very fiery voice. He presented his argument with factual statements, and he spoke to the audience and told them the facts. He was very powerful, and he talked about change. And as he talked, he bounced up and down. On another section, someone mentioned that Marcantonio supported a bill to outlaw lynching. To start this chapter, I started off how Dory Miller was the first casualty in World War II when Pearl Harbor was bombed. He was the first person to die. Marcantonio rose up in the House to pay tribute to Dory Miller, who was also African American, if you didn't know. And also, Mark tried to buttress the Fair Employment Practices Commission, FEPC, through an executive order by President Roosevelt. The FEPC was designed to end employment discrimination. However, Marcantonio's congressional colleagues consistently voted to weaken FEPC. A decade after Marcantonio's death, through the Civil Rights Act, FEPC became law. Marcantonio also engineered the passage of a House bill which outlawed the poll tax. This method was strategically used to deny African Americans and poor whites the right to vote. Marcantonio passed the law in the House on several occasions, but the Senate employed the filibuster to defeat the bill. Again, a decade after his death, the 25th Amendment to the Constitution outlawed this practice. Finally, Marcantonio proposed a bill to outlaw lynching in the United States. All of these measures were not lost on African Americans, as James Bryant, African American who grew up in East Harlem, recalls. People labeled him a communist, but he was the type of guy that if you had a problem with your relief checks, he made sure you received them. He captivated the hearts of these Harlem people, and he had a following among blacks. People would say, you have a problem with rent or the landlord? Go to Marcantonio. I have a couple of more, which I'll read. This is from Eugene Nardelli, who was a judge, I believe, on the Supreme Court. He, Italian East Harlemite, who grew up in East Harlem. And he remembers meeting Vito Marcantonio. Marcantonio attended to the community himself. You visited his office for any problem you had, and he personally listened to you. I remember going with my father to 116th Street office, and you waited there and you saw him, and he would refer you to a lawyer. One time our apartment went without water for months, and he helped our family get the water running again. You either loved him or you hated him. Finally, Norman C. Eddy, who was a Protestant member of the East Harlem Protestant Parish, who passed away last year at the age of 93. He remembers seeing Vito Marcantonio at his 116th Street congressional office. You walked in and he'd greet you and listen to your problem. Then he would direct you to the person who knew about the situation. If it was housing, he will point you to the housing assistant. And if it was education, then he will point you to an education expert on the staff. Or if you needed a lawyer, then a lawyer was there to assist you. Or one more I'm going to read, and I think everybody could relate to this. This is from Ray Grist. Marcantonio was a big hero, and every Sunday he sponsored a black party or a little fair for the East River Projects. The East River Projects was the first housing project built in East Harlem with the assistance of Marcantonio's help. There would be a stage, and then an Italian band came and played music. Next, a big white sheet was set up, and on the side of the building, movies would be shown on summer nights. I want to thank you for taking time to hear my stories of Vito Marcantonio. It's an honor to be here with all of you. And next,
yeah, I'd like to add that he really has a lot of great information. Yeah, he's a wonderful historian. He's helped us out tremendously. And there's one thing he said, I don't think anyone said that, it was very interesting, that a lot of people in East Harlem in particular pay tribute by naming their children after Mark Antonio. When you hear the name Mark, M-A-R-C, that's a lot of people were naming him after Mark Antonio. I'm trying to think of the most well-known person, maybe, the crossover pop singer, Mark Anthony is one such person. Another thing that Chris said that I'm really thankful for is he really, epitomized what we do in saying, I never heard it said better. The forum feels that Vito Marcantonio was unjustly ignored. And I think that really puts it all in perspective. So I'd really like to thank you, Chris, for all the work you've done.